The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, labor organizer Joseph Uehlein makes the case for protecting workers in the Green New Deal. Filmmaker Mac Heller exposes the Republican strategy to suppress the vote and win elections. Plus, Bill Press talks with the authors of A Very Stable Genius, Donald J. Trump's Testing of America. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Joseph Uehlein works at the forefront of building union support for the effort to confront climate change. He says the Green New Deal has the potential to rebuild the labor movement and unite the working class. And we say hello to Joseph Uehlein as the founding president of the Labor Network for Sustainability and Voices for a Sustainable Future. Joe Uehlein, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Well, thanks for having me. It's good to be talking to you today.
And our pleasure to have you with us. There's a conversation being put out there, and I'll point out mostly by the fossil fuel industry, that says supporting the Green New Deal pits politicians against potential working class voters. Is there any truth to that?
No. And I know it is a fossil fuel industry talking point, and sadly, they have close relationships with a number of fossil fuel unions. So the talking points get transmitted beyond the industry itself to their allies. And that's what helps give these talking points some feet. But no, it's a scare tactic. It's not new. This has been used in the past around climate issues and other related things.
There was some opposition to the Green New Deal early on from unions. Where do unions stand now?
Well, there's been a lot of local unions and labor councils that have endorsed the Green New Deal, all in many in different ways. So I kind of say they've endorsed a Green New Deal. Some have endorsed the Green New Deal, but others it's a variation on the Green New Deal. But that's okay. It's all building toward a common outcome. But nationally, there's probably only one or two unions that have endorsed the Green New Deal. So that's been kind of static over the last few months. But SEIU, obviously a big union, endorsed it over the summer, and as did the American Association of Flight Attendants.
Do you get the feeling that others will come around?
Oh, I do, definitely. When you look at the objection early on to the Green New Deal, it was, there were several, they said, well, we weren't consulted. And that's kind of I don't know, it reflects weakness for starters. I don't think it's a good talking point for them, but the truth is they were consulted, so it's not even an accurate objection. But anyway, that's what they said. We weren't consulted. And secondly, it's short on specifics. Well, that's kind of the whole idea with a resolution. That resolution provides a framework through which a lot of specifics can be built out, added to and built out. And the irony in that is that there was a move to create a special committee to do just that, to hold hearings on the Green New Deal and fill in all the specifics. And many of the groups, unions included, who complained that it was short on specifics, opposed the creation of that committee. So there is some gamesmanship that's very common in Washington. They're all expert at it, and that's what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. Now, your organization, the Labor Network for Sustainability, recently released a paper titled "No Worker Left Behind: Protecting Workers and Communities in the Green New Deal." And it looks at a variety of plans for a Green New Deal and how they allow for a just transition. For starters, what does just transition mean?
What it means is that no worker or community who through no fault of their own are going to be damaged by changes that are either needed on a societal level or required through law, say to address the climate crisis, that they should not pay the price. They should not be the ones who suffer. So the concept of just transition is just that working people and communities need to be made whole when these changes take place.
Now, we can't go into the details of all the plans covered in the report, but as you look across them, what are some of the key provisions that you see that would justify support from labor unions?
Well, I think the most important provision that would justify support from unions is that we believe in and call for a 5-year maintenance of income and benefits provision, which means if you're a worker in an oil refinery and you're making $100,000 a year and you have pension benefits and health care, which is standard in unionized refineries, and that refinery shuts down, you get that for 5 years. At the same time, there'll be training and other kinds of job placement and so on, but you get that for 5 years. So you have a cushion with which to adjust your life in a way that you're kind of being forced to do.
Interesting. We're speaking with Joe Uehlein, the founding president of the Labor Network for Sustainability and also Voices for a Sustainable Future. Joe, about a year ago, you wrote a piece for In These Times titled 12 Reasons Labor Should Demand a Green New Deal. In it, you wrote about Roosevelt's New Deal. What can the Green New Deal learn from the New Deal when it comes to protecting workers?
Well, it can learn a lot. I mean, the New Deal put into place a system of labor management relations that worked, for quite a while. I mean, it helped build the modern labor movement, but it also fell apart, and it was amended several times and weakened several times, and that accompanied by a corporate strategy to break the law, purposely break the law, that all needs to be fixed. So a new Green New Deal could fix the weaknesses in the original New Deal law, the National Labor Relations Act.
You know, and one of the more powerful reasons you give for why labor should demand a Green New Deal is that it has the power to rebuild the labor movement. How do you see that happening?
Yeah. Well, the way that happens is if we can get the Green New Deal, become in bits and pieces, but enacted into law, there will be millions of jobs created. And this is the greatest organizing opportunity that the labor movement has seen since the original New Deal. We'll be building a 100% renewable electric system, a new smart grid, retrofitting all the buildings, starting with government buildings, industrial buildings, going to all residential buildings, reconstructing how we manufacture, how we do agriculture. These are all going to be transportation, completely has to be re-envisioned and imagined and put into place. And we have the opportunity to do it in a way that where equity and worker justice is centered in all of this. And when you look at that job creation potential coupled with the Green New Deal's assertion of a living wage for every person who wants first a guaranteed job. So that's central. There's a federal jobs guarantee in the Green New Deal and jobs at a living wage. Now, I would say family supporting wage. And when the time comes to testify, that's what we'll be fighting for. But the guaranteed job is important because it's the best way to shrink the labor market, which forces wages and benefits up across the board and enables unions to do what they do best, which means negotiate good contracts. So this is a huge opportunity for organized labor.
Now, you also write that the Green New Deal has the potential to unite the working class. How would that work, or is that really what you were just describing in the previous question?
It's a bit of that, but there's more to it. So the equity issue is central. It has to be central right along with economic justice, which means we have to do everything within our power through this Green New Deal to sort of enable racism and sexism and other kinds of discrimination to fade into the past. We build equity into the job creation. We provide ladders out of poverty. For example, for people who could never aspire to get into a good union apprenticeship program or job training program, we have the opportunity to provide them a way of doing that, of getting into and that's central to all of this. So we want to even everything out and do away with the sort of cultural competition that you sometimes find in these programs and in society. That can be addressed in this Green New Deal.
Now, as we move forward in this election season, do you have a sense that Democrats see the necessity of linking together the two issues of climate change and economic justice for workers?
I think so. We're hearing it a lot from most of the Democratic candidates, and some of them are very strong on it, like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. They're the strongest. But even others, I mean, we're not hearing a lot from Joe Biden about it, a little bit, but there are, some newcomers to this thing, like Michael Bloomberg, and, he had a good labor record in the city of New York, and he's certainly done his thing on climate, so he might start talking about this. I don't know that he will. I don't know that much about him, but it is on the debate stage, and it is in all the, it was in Iowa, New Hampshire, going forward. They're talking about this stuff.
And it's about time. I mean, really, it's about time. Joe Uehlein, founding president of the Labor Network for Sustainability and Voices for a Sustainable Future, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Joe, we appreciate your time with us. Would love to have you back again soon.
Sure, I'd be happy to come back. Just let me know.
Great. Thanks very much. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America. Whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, inside the GOP voter suppression playbook. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Remember when candidate Trump promised not only to wall out all migrants crossing our Mexican border, but also to make Mexico pay for his xenophobic wall? Well, Mexico hasn't paid a peso and won't. So he keeps running to Congress demanding that it pony up unlimited billions of our tax dollars for his pet political project. Aside from one token appropriation, however, Congress has said, no. But that's no hill for a narcissistic climber. Unable to get tax money legitimately, Trump has simply stolen it, taking money from the U.S. military budget. Ignoring the constitutional mandate that only Congress is empowered to control the flow of government money, Trump filched $6.1 billion from our military last year, snatched another $3.8 billion this month, and intends to swipe at least another $3.4 billion before the year is out. This executive reprogramming, as the White House euphemistically calls its daylight robbery, is being pulled off by masking Trump's wall obsession as a, quote, national emergency. The Pentagon brass has been yanking funds meant for the Army, Air Force, Navy, Marines, National Guard, and ultimately from our fighting forces. This is Jim Hightower saying, presidential autocracy aside, Trump's massive larceny raises 3 other interesting issues of public morality. 1, his trickery sets a precedent, not only for future presidents, but also for our young people's behavior. 2, our Congress critters, especially Trump Republicans, are setting a new standard of craven meekness in the face of this direct executive assault on their authority and on our democracy. And 3, by simply kissing off a budget loss of more than $13 billion, saying it's in excess of the military's needs, the Pentagon is admitting that the war machine is routinely taking way too much of the public's money.
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Filmmaker Mac Heller's latest documentary takes a deep dive into the carefully crafted campaign being used by Republicans to suppress voting. It's a compelling story of democracy at peril and what we can do about it. And we say hello to Mac Heller, co-executive producer, along with Tim Smith, of the documentary Rigged, the Voter Suppression Playbook. Mac Heller, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats Podcast.
Jim, thank you for having me. Thanks very much.
Oh, our pleasure to have you with us. You know, making a film like this no doubt consumed your life for a considerable period of time. What made you decide to make this film?
You know, I saw what was going on in our country, and it's just wrong. And I can't think of anything more important to do. And I think more and more people in this election year are coming to understand that the health of our democracy is threatened, and they need to find some time to protect it, to protect each other, to protect what it means to be an American citizen. And the vote has always been at the very center of that. So going back a few years, I've always been proud of voting in America. I've always been proud of our democracy. And I was always puzzled and frustrated that not everybody was voting. And so I always watched it. I always was interested, and I was particularly proud of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Just a fabulous law, corrected a centuries-old wrong, brought millions of American citizens into our democracy. And in 2013, in a Supreme Court case called Shelby County versus Holder, the Voting Rights Act was severely gutted by that opinion. And I was puzzled by that and actually went and read the opinion and was very concerned by it, because I viewed that opinion as very dangerous to our democracy, because it opened the door for a bunch of states to potentially pass laws that remove the right to vote from people who just received it 50 years before. And of course, that's just what happened. Once Shelby County versus Holder came down in 2013, a whole bunch of states started to pass laws that trimmed, limited, curtailed, foreshortened, shrank the right of many of our fellow citizens to vote. I just think that's wrong. And I want to shout it from the rooftops that we as citizens need to stop it.
Yeah, absolutely. 100% agree with that. Now, the film, Mac, begins in Chicago in 2008 with the election of Barack Obama. Why was this particular election a turning point in the story of voter suppression?
You know, Jim, we thought about starting the film in 1865, starting the film in 1965 with the Civil Rights Movement. But the more we listened to the people advocating voter suppression laws, the laws that limit the right of our fellow citizens to vote, the more we listened to them, the more they seem to hang their activism in vote suppression on the election of President Obama. They would say oblique things like, I don't know about you, but for me, something changed in 2008. I felt the country was no longer my own. I thought that was deeply wrong. But more particularly, when you look at these laws, we didn't have a problem in this country with voter ID laws. Just to take one example, if you wanted to vote, you needed to establish your identity, but you could use a utility bill or a driver's license or a bank statement, just whatever was reasonable. And the incidence of voter fraud in our committed by voters pretending to be somebody else, that's been essentially non-existent in the recent past. But these laws, starting in 2009, 2010, 2011, start to explode. Basically, two strong voter ID laws before 2008 and about 25 by a point 4 or 5 years later. And that concerned me greatly. So you have to pick a point to start your film, and that corner, first Obama in 2008. What happened from there is that one party did a very good job taking over a series of state legislatures in 2010, which allowed them to control the redistricting process in 2011 and allowed them to gerrymander a number of states, which allowed them then to go on and pass a series of egregious voter suppression laws in the years following that. So the film, and you've seen it, goes through those steps as steps of a thoughtfully crafted plan to continue to retain power without the allegiance of a majority of Americans.
And you're referring to Project Red Map. And as the film indicates, or the title of the film indicates, Rigged, the voter suppression playbook. So this is just one of the plays within. What does Project Red Map tell us about how the voter suppression effort is organized and funded?
The voter suppression effort has been thoughtfully constructed by a set of very affluent people who spent their money shrewdly to limit our democracy in a series of ways that are sustained over the 10-year redistricting period. These are Americans for Prosperity, the American Legislative Exchange Council, a whole series of institutions formed by major right-wing funders that then financed, for instance, the campaigns to take over state legislatures, financed the gerrymandering efforts of 2010, 2011, financed and propagated the voter suppression laws that followed.
Now, another page out of this playbook, if you will, that you focus on is the Voter Integrity Commission, which used the fear of non-existent voter fraud to encourage voter suppression. You touched on that a moment ago, but the commission is now disbanded. But what kind of damage did it do before that?
It tried to do a substantial amount of damage. The intent of the Voter Suppression Commission, it was called the Voter Integrity Commission, was to gather data on voter fraud in all of the 50 states. They did not publish that they found any. And one terrific moment in the film is when a New York Times reporter named Michael Wines, who's a very low-key guy, after our section on the Voter Fraud Commission, Michael is on camera saying, after the 2016 election, and this is the election where the president has said that there was 3 to 5 million illegal votes cast. Michael Wines, called all 50 state capitals, all 50 secretaries of state in the state capitals, managed to reach 49 of them. And in every case, they would have no more than 1, 2, 3, 4 possible instances of voter fraud, and many states had none at all. And so the facts are, and anyone who's studied the problem has established that the facts are that actual fraud by voters, especially assuming the identity of someone else to vote, which is what the president has alleged, the facts are that is vanishingly rare. And so I don't know why Trump disbanded it, but he, at the point where they were failing to gather the evidence that they hoped, and I think the academic community, which actually insists on facts in this regard, was very much poised to analyze whatever evidence or quasi-evidence they presented. They shrewdly backed off and disbanded the commission. But the allegations of voter fraud have continued and will continue. I've spent more time than I'd like to admit actually going into specific cases of allegations of voter fraud. But as recently as a few months ago, the Secretary of State of Texas said that he'd found as many as, I think it was 85,000 illegal aliens who were registered to vote, and that he was going after them and they were going to be arrested. And it turned out actually that they weren't illegal aliens. Almost all of them were citizens. He ultimately had to put his tail between his legs and retract his statements. But the allegation was out there. Rick Scott made some allegations of fraud in 2018 in Florida. It's a thing. that we'll see as 2020 approaches. If I'm losing the election, some politicians say it must have been fraud, but it's a horribly serious allegation, needs to be investigated, and in the hundreds of investigations that I've analyzed, it is almost always the case that something that starts out as, like the one in Texas, as many as X fraudulent votes, months later, the thing disappears in a whimper. I'll give you one funny/sad example of this. The president saying that there were 3 million or 3 to 5 million illegal votes may have been based on a tweet by a guy named Greg Phillips. And Greg famously went on CNN with Chris Cuomo and said he had the evidence and would share it, but wouldn't share it actually at that moment. Now, Greg has never shared that evidence, and he's withdrawn his tweet that there were 3 million illegal votes. But the president continues. So it's much more about the allegation than the fact, and it's very damaging.
Yeah, no doubt about it. We're speaking with Mac Heller, co-executive producer of the documentary Rigged, the Voter Suppression Playbook. And there are, Mac, a lot of disturbing aspects of the film. One in particular, the degree to which voter suppression efforts are focused on communities of color. As you make clear, some have their roots in Jim Crow. But outside of those communities, do you have a sense that Americans understand this?
Not enough. Not enough. I think that there is needs to be much more understanding of what's really going on here. It's no deeper than the president standing in front of a rally in 2016 and saying that there will be voter fraud, and he wants his followers to go into, quote, certain places in Philadelphia. You know what I'm talking about. Close quote, and look for the people committing the fraud. So it's a thinly veiled racial epithet, and it's a grave sin against the culture of our country and needs to be stopped.
Mm-hmm. And another disturbing aspect of the film are the interviews with Republicans. There seems to be no shame about suppressing the vote. Did that surprise you?
It did. And if there was any shame back then, there's less now. This voter fraud narrative is an important shame reduction device for the people passing these laws. In other words, the fiction is that there's a substantial amount of voter fraud out there, and we need to pass these laws to stop it. We've invested. I hate fraud, by the way, and I'm sure you do too. And I think whatever fraud is out there needs to be stopped. But we looked into it, and that's not what these laws are about. There's not a substantial amount of fraud, and when the laws are passed, they are actually not targeted to stop what fraud does exist. I'll give you an example. North Carolina doesn't have a problem with in-person voter impersonation, voter fraud, to which voter ID is a solution. That's a non-problem. The number of such cases in the 2016 election out of 4.8 million votes cast was 1. But North Carolina does have a problem with fraud in the absentee ballot area. And of course, you're aware of the instance in 2018 when the campaign of an aspirant for Congress was accused of misbehavior concerning hundreds of ballots, all of them absentee ballots. Well, the big North Carolina voter suppression bill passed in 2013, right after Shelby County versus Holder came down, did a lot to prevent individual voters from getting to the polls. But it didn't do anything to regulate absentee ballot fraud. Why? The North Carolina legislature actually asked for and received data on how black people voted versus white people. And in North Carolina, African Americans are more likely to vote early. They're more likely to vote on Sunday. They're more likely to register closer to Election Day, including Election Day. They're more likely to vote out of precinct, especially if their precinct is moved. They are less likely to vote absentee. So guess what that law changed? It limited all these ways that African Americans vote in North Carolina. It did not limit the ways that are more predominantly adopted by white people, even though that's where the fraud was. So once you get into this, it becomes more and more concerning, and you see the role of race more and more clearly.
It just leaves me shaking my head. I mean, as we're having this conversation, you can't imagine that we're actually in the 21st century. And this film...
Can I give you one more?
Sure.
The current issue going on in Florida. So the following story is going to make you encouraged and discouraged. Florida voters in 2018 passed an amendment. Florida voters Florida citizens who have committed a felony have been disenfranchised for many, many years. In 2018, there was a proposition on the ballot, number 4, that said after people have served their sentence, they can vote again. And it passed with something like 65% positive votes, so roundly endorsed by the citizens. And this had the effect of bringing back into the electorate 1.4 million Florida citizens, a huge number. And they are disproportionately of color versus the broader Florida population. However, the state legislature, in the implementing legislation around this change, required that all fees and fines and restitution be paid before reenfranchisement was proper. And the governor supported this, and recently the Florida Supreme Court has supported this. So this will take back out of the voting population hundreds of thousands of people, because people in Florida criminal defendants in Florida can be charged for parole supervision, a whole series of fees and fines, such that if you're poor and you get out of prison and you have behaved perfectly, but you don't have several $1,000s to pay off all these fees and fines, you'll never vote again. Sorry, it's only for people with money. So, and to the extent being a criminal defendant in Florida hits people of color more, or being poor hits people of color more. That's what this law does. It's not confusing what's going on here.
No, it's not, sadly. And this documentary is remarkable in the way it connects the dots on such a broad landscape of voter suppression that reaches all the way into the White House. Where do you put your hope that this can be turned around?
I believe that American citizens believe that we all have the right to vote, and our country is better when every eligible American citizen has the right to vote. And I think the more we expose what has gone on and why it has gone on, I think right-thinking centrists, such as myself, will say, I don't care how you're going to vote. I don't know how you're going to vote, but I believe you should have the right to vote, and they're going to stop this.
We can only hope. Mac Heller, co-executive producer, along with Tim Smith of Rigged, the voter suppression playbook documentary. If you want to check it out, go to the website, riggedthefilm.com. Mac, thank you very much for your time with us today on the America's Democrats podcast. We look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Jim, thank you. Our film is available on Amazon Prime and iTunes. I hope people will watch it. I'm here in sunny Las Vegas, where we'll have a screening at UNLV. And thanks for helping us spread the word.
Absolutely. Glad that we could do it. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. A very stable genius? Bill Press on a new book about the dysfunctional chaos inside Donald Trump's White House.
A very stable genius. Where'd the title come from, Carol?
Well, we were nearly done with the manuscript and the editing, and Phil and I had been asked to think hard and long about the title, and of course you always put off the hardest thing to the end. We both independently, as we were talking, started to talk about that word choice of his. And at first we felt that it might be a little edgy and that we had a little bit of worry about that. But we also realized the more and more we focused on our work that we wanted to use his words, to stress test his own definition of himself, hold it up against a mirror and hold it up to the people who knew him best. We did more than 200 interviews. We interviewed more than 200 people who were close to him, senior advisors, former and current top-level officials in his administration, good friends. And not to a person, but in large measure, they did not find him to be a very stable genius and did not describe him that way.
But what does it say, Phil, to you that he describes himself, or that anybody would describe themselves as a very stable genius, which he said in Quebec, right?
He has said it a number of times. The first time he used this phrase to describe himself came in January of 2018, about a year into the presidency. There was a national dialogue underway at that time about his mental acuity, his psychological health, his very fitness for the job. And he defended himself by saying, I'm not only a genius, but I'm a very stable genius. And he's, of course, used that term at least 4 additional times since then. You know, the people that we talked to for this book pointed out that anyone who's a stable genius would not call him or herself that. But it does speak to how, you know, Trump is so focused, and we show this in the reporting in the book, so focused on his self-image and what people think of him and establishing his supremacy. He thinks he's smarter than all of his intelligence briefers. He thinks he knows more about the military than the generals do. He thinks he knows more about the economy than Gary Cohn did, and so on and so forth.
You know, so I don't take this the wrong way, but I loved your book. I loved the book.
How can we take that the wrong way?
I know. Well, because just before I read this book, I read a book called I Heard You Paint Houses, which is the book that The Irishman is based on. And I found them very similar in this sense, that The Irishman is just one mob hit after another. And your book is just one presidential outrage after another over the first 3 years. And the question I have is reminding myself of all the things that Trump has done and said. I find myself surprised that he's still there. Does it surprise you that he's survived these 3 years that have been pretty wild?
It's one of the themes.
Or that we've survived.
And our institutions, right?
Yeah.
It's one of the themes that Phil and I found ourselves sort of surprised by, but really understanding better as a result of archaeologically re-excavating these scenes that we reported in real time for the Washington Post. We dig deeper into them, and the theme that we come back away with is this is a president who increasingly drives the grown-ups out of the room, the people who wanted to give him good counsel and help a novice public servant, someone with no political experience, no governing experience. Those people, those guardrails are gone. And with each sort of chapter, The president increasingly views himself as a man who is the best at making these decisions. He doesn't need all these other people. And he's also increasingly emboldened. He beat, a criminal investigation that found substantial evidence that would normally get another person thrown in jail, convicted and thrown in jail for obstruction of a criminal probe. He beat that. And with time, he became more emboldened. Literally the day after the sort of coda for the special counsel investigation, he picks up the phone and asks a foreign leader for a favor in a domestic political election for his own benefit. And he beat, he would use these words himself, he beat the rap of the claims that he had behaved improperly or illegally in seeking Zelensky's help in investigating Joe Biden and his son. With the idea that past his prologue, he's just increasingly more and more unshackled and confident in his own decision-making, no matter how many norms it busts.
Right. So, think about that. As you point out, the Mueller investigation, as serious as it was and as serious as the findings were in the report, he just basically walks and then impeached. Yes, he has been impeached, but the Senate acquittal. And so, Phil, he must see looking forward that he's in fact, able to do as president whatever he wants.
Yeah, our reporting has shown that over these last 3 years, he's increasingly viewed himself as above the law and, not subject to accountability the way a mortal being might be. He thinks as president, he can do as he pleases, and he has faith that the Republicans in Congress and those that control the Senate are going to have his back no matter what it is that he does. And that's been proven not only in the Mueller investigation and through the impeachment proceedings, but think of all the other norms he's shattered or violations of what would traditionally be seen as the public trust that he has had and gotten away with, or the racist comments that he's made, or the misogynistic moments in his presidency where he's not really faced much consequence other than, half of the country disapproving of his performance. And so going forward, I anticipate that mindset to continue and even grow because of the unwillingness of Republicans in the Senate to stand up to him, Mitt Romney being the exception, of course.
You mentioned, Carol, over 200 people. Is Donald Trump one of them?
Donald Trump, as we say in the beginning of the book, was interested in sitting down for an interview with us and actually told Phil in a pretty memorable moment for us that he viewed Phil as a very fair reporter. He wanted a serious book done, and he was looking forward to talking to Phil. Phil took the opportunity of a phone call back from the president to explain to him about our book, and that's where he made this offer. But as time went on and the war with the media, but especially with the Washington Post, escalated, President Trump withdrew from that offer and through AIDS declined to talk to us. And we're very disappointed and sad. We would have loved to hear his explanation rather than everyone else's around him for why he did what he did.
Have you gotten any phone calls since the book came out?
Not from the president. We've gotten a couple tweets from the president. He's not pleased with the book and has attacked me and Carol personally, but we've not spoken with him directly.
Right, which you might, I guess you expected that those...
It's exactly what you'd expect. But it's worth pointing out, Bill, that even though we didn't talk to the president for the story, we did everything we could in our journalistic power to fact-check the scenes and the dialogue and the actions that are attributed to him in the book with multiple sources, with a review of diary entries, calendar entries, in one case of a video recording. We really tried to give him the benefit of the doubt and make sure that everything that we printed in this book was the truth as best we knew it.
Well, one thing many things that struck me, one of them I wanted to ask you about is, and Carol, you alluded to this earlier, that from your reporting, and when you put it all together here, it's stunning to me to see how many good people with a pretty good reputation in this town, went to work for Donald Trump and had their careers destroyed and are no longer there. I mean, I did a little list just off the top of my head, and I'm sure there's some here that I'll miss, but in no particular order: Sean Spicer, Reince Priebus, Anthony Scaramucci, Steve Bannon, Don McGahn, Michael Flynn, John Kelly, James Mattis, Rex Tillerson, Kirsten Nielsen, Jeff Sessions, Gary Cohn, H.R. McMaster, John Bolton. who's left? I mean, who, about the people around him, what does this say?
You know, sometimes there have been moments when it felt like it was an episode of The Apprentice, you're fired, you know, almost like it was exciting to end each show with you're fired. What we found was that a lot of the people who tried to explain to the president, this is illegal, or this is worrisome, or this is not the way the U.S. government works, those people got a pink slip or a tweet in the middle of the night. And increasingly, the people around the president view their mission as telling him yes. Just as a comparison, we are told by multiple people that John Kelly often took the president privately aside and said, Mr. President, you had this idea today that is not going to work. We are not going to do that. There's a scene in the book where John Kelly tells the president, if you want to give your son-in-law a clearance over the objections of the career public servants who know how to do this, you're going to have to do it yourself. I'm not doing it. So you see what happened to John Kelly. Now, fast forward to our current scenario that is at the center of the impeachment investigation and ultimately the House's impeachment of President Trump. Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney was willing and comfortable agreeing to block the aid to Ukraine that Ukraine was relying upon to save its soldiers in a battle with Russia, was willing to withhold it even though his office and his lawyers were getting warnings from the Government Accountability Office that withholding that aid was illegal. But that's what Donald Trump wanted, and that's what Mick Mulvaney gave him.
Right. But the one thing that Donald Trump demands, what we've told more than anything else of people around him, is loyalty. Loyalty. It sounds like it's a one-way street.
It is, and it has been for years now. The guiding principle of this administration is loyalty, as you point out, but it's not loyalty to the country, which is what we've seen in past administrations. It's loyalty to Trump, the man, Trump, the brand, Trump, the president. And, he has zero tolerance for any kind of personal or political betrayal. And once somebody betrays him, and it's in his estimation, what that betrayal might be. For example, Steve Bannon appearing on the cover of Time magazine was an act of betrayal to President Trump. So, Trump will internalize that and turn against people and shuts them out and pushes them out of the government. There's no tolerance for that. But he doesn't provide the same loyalty back. So there are people who've served him for years and acted loyally to him and do not get the same kind of personal loyalty in return from the president.
Is there anybody, did you find anybody around him today who's willing to say, Mr. President, you're wrong, like John Kelly did? I think some others that you mentioned did. Gary Cohn, you cannot do this. Or even, I think, at one point, Jeff Sessions said, no, we can't do that.
I mean, you think about all of the people who said no, and they are gone. In our reporting, that happened to Kirstjen Nielsen. It happened to Jeff Sessions. What were their crimes? They tried to remind him that the things he was proposing to do were illegal or unethical in the case of Jeff Sessions. But, in terms of today, there are surely instances where people are trying to talk the president out of some of his more impulsive, rash decisions. I know for a fact that the president very much wanted to get rid of some of these National Security Council staff, but he was encouraged not to do it until after the acquittal or the Senate trial, whichever came first. After the Senate trial was completed, and indeed minutes after his acquittal, that is the first thing he did.
I understand how people could be treated that way who work for the president in the White House. I had heard about this before, but until I read your reporting, I must admit I was shocked by the meeting at the Pentagon you talk about, where he went with, James Mattis was there, of course, and Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, and unloaded on the generals. Phil, tell us about that.
Yeah, so this was a harrowing moment in the first year of the presidency, July of 2017, about 6 months in. And the defense secretary, the secretary of state, Gary Cohn, the economic advisor, all were concerned with Trump's lack of knowledge about the world and lack of understanding about our alliances and military deployments. So they arranged a tutorial in a room at the Pentagon called the Tank. It's really a sacred sanctum space, the conference room for the Joint Chiefs of Staff where decisions of war and peace are made. They get the president there. They start doing a tutorial, a slideshow to show him where we have troops around the world, why we're a part of NATO, underscoring the importance of different alliances and deployments. And Trump was impatient. He didn't like being lectured to or schooled in that environment, and he started bellowing.
Because he knew it all.
He thought he knew it all, so he started barking and bellowing at the generals and at the other civilians who were around the table. He said the war in Afghanistan was a loser war. He said that the generals were a bunch of dopes and babies. And the thing that really got people going was he said, "I wouldn't go to war with you people." Those are the president's words. Nobody stood up to him except for Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State. And after that meeting concluded, Tillerson was overheard in a hallway telling some of his colleagues that the president was an effing moron. It was the end of their relationship. But even worse was the fact that this is the commander-in-chief disrespecting the high brass of the military, not really showing a patience for understanding his responsibilities as president. And these are the very people that he would have to rely upon to lead the United States into war in the future.
It is stunning that none of the generals fought back or challenged him. Did you find that?
Yeah. Well, Phil describes it so well.
Although he's the commander-in-chief, maybe I'm misreading the military code, if you will.
There were people in the room who talked to Phil and to me who said that the thing that was so chilling was the silence, but not just from the flag officers and generals. Mike Pence said nothing. He was a sort of a wax figure, as described by some people. A woman appeared to be crying and bending her head forward to sort of conceal what was happening in her eyes. And Rex Tillerson, as told to us by witnesses there, was looking at Mattis like his eyes boring into Mattis's head. They're very close friends, but Mattis wasn't saying anything. He had his head bowed as well. And finally, Tillerson just said, well, I guess in his head, he's thinking, I guess these officers can't buck their commander-in-chief. I'm going to have to say something. And he was, what he stood up and said, he said again in another meeting in December, when the president was also lambasting the officers in the Situation Room, talking about how they needed to make money on these troops and start charging foreign governments for the bases that we have there that ultimately keep us safe. But Donald Trump wanted other countries to pay for the safety they provided those regions. And Tillerson stood up with his back this time to the president and said, I didn't put on a uniform, but I know people who did, his father, his uncle, his great uncle, and they don't put it on to make a buck. They do it to protect our freedom. And the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Dunford, called Tillerson later that night after that meeting and said, thank you for taking the body blows for us. I'll never forget it.
Bill Press talking with Carol Leonnig and Philip Rucker, authors of A Very Stable Genius, Donald J. Trump's Testing of America. If you'd like to hear the entire interview, visit BillPressPods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Joseph Uehlein, Mac Heller, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter. And leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.